At night, we begin to ask questions we didn't ask during the day. Why did that person choose that moment, that path, that decision? And if on that night a different choice had been made, what kind of world would we be living in now? History is usually remembered by what happened in daylight: speeches, battles, declarations, victories. But decisions are often made when no one is watching, by a river, with only the sound of water moving in the dark, in a room lit by a single candle, inside a tent as rain presses down from the sky, or in silence where even words feel too heavy. This video will not give you answers. It will not tell you who was right or who was wrong. We will simply stand a little closer to those nights and watch. The nights when people hesitated. The nights when fear was present. The nights when an unchosen world paused just for a moment. And if tonight you are carrying a question you have not yet decided, that is all right. Some stories do not need to be understood right away to be kept close. Now let us quietly begin the 7 nights that changed the world.
Episode 1: The Night at the Rubicon. The night was quiet, quieter than anyone expected. There were no speeches, no raised banners, no clash of metal, only a river. The Rubicon was not wide. It was not deep. It did not look like a boundary that could divide a world, and yet it did. On one side stood the laws of Rome. On the other stood everything that would follow if those laws were broken. At the edge of the water, a man waited. Julius Caesar did not stand alone, but it felt that way. Behind him were soldiers who had followed him for years, men who had marched, fought, and survived together. Men who trusted him with their lives. Ahead of him was silence. Rome had made its position clear. If he crossed this river with an army, he would be declaring war on the Republic itself. He would no longer be a general. He would become something else, an enemy, a traitor. Or, if history bent in his favor, something far more dangerous. The river did not move quickly. It did not rush him. It flowed as it always had in different politics, unaware of consequences. This was not a moment of confusion. Caesar understood exactly what the choice was. Return south and he would surrender his command, face trial, and likely disappear into political ruin. Step forward and the Republic would not survive the night unchanged. The decision was clear. What was unclear was whether the world was ready for it. The soldiers waited. They did not speak. They had learned over years of campaign that some moments were not meant to be filled with words. A command would come, or it would not. The weight of the decision did not come from fear alone. It came from certainty. Once the river was crossed, there would be no explanation that could undo it. No letter, no apology, no negotiation. The act itself would become the message. The Rubicon had been chosen deliberately, long before this night, as a line that could not be crossed without consequence. Rome believed in boundaries, not just physical ones, but moral and legal lines that held the Republic together. This river was one of them. Caesar knew this. That is why he had stopped here, The night air was cold. Water moved slowly over stones. Somewhere behind him, a horse shifted its weight. Leather creaked softly. Time passed. Not much, but enough. Enough for doubt to exist, and then be set aside. The choice was not between good and evil. It was between control and uncertainty. By crossing the Rubicon, Caesar would give up the illusion that events could still be managed within the system. He would be choosing momentum over permission. Rome had rules, but Rome also had history. And history, more often than not, rewarded those who acted before consensus could form. This was not courage in the way it is often imagined. It was calculation. The understanding that waiting would only narrow the path forward. That hesitation at this point was also a decision. The river continued to flow. Then finally Caesar moved. Not dramatically, not quickly. He stepped forward. Water reached his boots. There was no thunder, no signal from the sky. But something irreversible had happened. Behind him, the soldiers followed. They did not need to be told. Crossing the Rubicon did not end the Republic that night. Wars would follow. Years of bloodshed, political collapse disguised as restoration. But this night made all of that possible, because a line had been crossed, not by accident, but by choice. Later generations would remember this moment as bold, as decisive, as the act of a man who shaped history. But standing by the river in the dark, it did not feel like triumph. It felt like silence. The kind of silence that comes after a door closes and before the sound of what comes next arrives. Rome would wake the next morning unaware that its old rules had already stopped working. The river would still be there, flowing unchanged, but the meaning attached to it would never be the same. Some nights are remembered because of what happened. Others are remembered because something ended quietly, without anyone fully realizing it at the time. The Rubicon was crossed before the world understood what that meant. And perhaps that is how history often moves. Not with certainty, but with a single step taken at night when there is no applause and no way back. Episode 2, The Last Night of Constantinople, 1453. The city did not sleep. It had not slept for weeks. Every night the walls trembled under the weight of impact. Cannon struck stone that had stood for centuries. Each blow sounded the same. Each pause felt longer than the last. Inside the city, fires burned low. Not from celebration, but from necessity. This was Constantinople, once the center of an empire, now a city holding its breath. At the heart of it stood a man who could still leave. Constantine the 11th Palaiologos was not trapped. Not yet. Ships waited in the harbor. Escape was possible. Others had already urged him to go. If he left, the city would fall without him. If he stayed, the city would still fall. The difference was not the outcome. It was the meaning. On this final night, he walked through streets he knew too well, streets that had once carried processions. Now they carried whispers. People did not ask him for promises. They did not ask for reassurance. They already understood. In the distance, the sound of the Ottoman camp never stopped. Voices, metal, movement. An entire army waiting for morning. Constantine went to Hagia Sophia. The great church stood dark and heavy, its vast space filled with shadows and candlelight. This was not a ceremony meant to inspire. There was no victory to prepare for. It was a gathering for endings. Soldiers stood beside citizens, nobles beside laborers. Differences that had mattered for centuries no longer did. What mattered was that they were still there, together, for one more night. Constantine did not speak as a conqueror. He spoke as someone who knew what would come. He asked forgiveness, not from history, but from the people who would share his fate. Outside the walls, the enemy prepared. Inside the city, there was nothing left to prepare. The choice had already been made. This was not a last stand born from desperation alone. It was a decision to remain present when absence would have been easier. Constantine could have survived the fall of the city. He could have lived on as a ruler without a capital, a name without a place. Instead, he chose something far less practical. He chose to stay. As the night deepened, he left the church and returned to the walls. Torches flickered in the wind. Armor caught brief flashes of light. From the battlements, the city looked quiet, almost peaceful. Beyond them, the Ottoman camp was vast, organized, certain. The imbalance was obvious. This was not a miscalculation. Constantine knew the numbers. He knew the odds. This was not a failure of strategy. It was the acceptance that some losses cannot be prevented, only witnessed. The emperor removed the symbols of his rank. There would be no need for them by morning. What remained was not authority, but presence. He stood where the walls were weakest, not because it would change the outcome, but because that was where the city would break first. Night stretched on. The city waited. At some point before dawn, the cannons fell silent. This silence was worse than the noise. It meant the assault was ready. In those final hours, there were no new plans, no secret strategies, only small movements, quiet adjustments, breathing. The city had already been lost in every practical sense. What remained was dignity. When the attack came, it came as expected. The walls failed. The defense collapsed. Constantine was last seen fighting, not as an emperor, but as a soldier among others. There would be no body identified with certainty, no tomb marked with precision. The city fell. History would later describe this night as the end of an era, the fall of Byzantium, the close of 1,000 years. But standing in the darkness, it did not feel like an era ending. It felt like a man deciding not to leave a place that had defined him. The world changed the next day. Trade routes shifted. Empires rose and fell. But this night remains because of a choice that did not save anything. A choice that did not alter the result, and yet it mattered, not because it stopped history, but because it showed how some people face it. The city of Constantinople did not survive the morning, but its last night was not empty. It was filled with people who stayed even when staying made no difference. And perhaps that is why this night is remembered. Not for victory, not for survival, but for the quiet weight of choosing presence over escape. Episode 3, The Desperate Night Aboard the Santa Maria, 1492. The sea offered no answers. It stretched outward in every direction, dark and uninterrupted, as if the world itself had decided to withhold reassurance. The Santa Maria moved slowly, its wooden body creaking with each small motion of the waves, not from damage but from age and from distance. They had been at sea longer than promised, longer than expected, longer than most believed was reasonable. On deck, men stood in silence, watching the horizon for something that refused to appear. Land. Christopher Columbus had given them a deadline, not written, but spoken. If no land appeared by morning, they would turn back. It was not an order. It was a compromise. The crew had not signed on for endless uncertainty. They had signed on for risk, yes, but risk with limits. This night was the edge of that limit. Below deck, the air was heavy. The smell of salt, wood, and human presence had settled into every corner of the ship. Some men slept, but not deeply. Others pretended to sleep, listening for footsteps, for voices, for any sign that a decision had already been made. The fear was not of dying at sea. That fear had been present from the beginning. The deeper fear was of having gone too far with nothing to show for it. Columbus did not sleep. He stood near the rail, eyes fixed on the darkness ahead. Maps lay useless below. Charts offered no comfort. Every calculation depended on a belief that could not be proven, that the world extended farther than experience suggested, that something waited beyond what was known. The sea remained silent. Behind him, whispers moved between small groups of men. They spoke of home, of families, of promises that now felt fragile. Some spoke of turning back at dawn. Others spoke of forcing the issue sooner. No one raised their voice. This was not anger, it was erosion. Confidence worn down by repetition. Columbus knew this. He had heard the change in their tone over the past days. The questions that were no longer disguised as curiosity. How much farther? How much longer? He had answered before. Now there were no new answers left to give. The ship continued forward, not because anyone was certain, but because no one had yet decided to stop. This was not exploration, as it would later be described. There were no speeches about destiny. There was only the arithmetic of survival, food counted carefully, water rationed, time measured by routine rather than hope. The stars above were clear, but unfamiliar. Navigation depended on patterns that had never been tested this far west. Each hour passed without change made the idea of turning back more reasonable. The promise of morning pressed heavily on the night. Columbus had said they would decide then. Morning had become a deadline no one wanted to reach. On deck, the wind shifted slightly. Sails adjusted with soft movements. The sound of water against the hull was constant, almost comforting, and dangerous. Comfort could become acceptance. Acceptance could become surrender. This night was not dramatic. There were no storms, no sudden omens. Its weight came from repetition, from the steady realization that belief alone might not be enough. Columbus understood the risk of waiting. If dawn came with nothing, he would lose control of the expedition. Authority at sea was practical, not symbolic. Men followed orders as long as those orders seemed to lead somewhere. This night tested that belief. He thought of the alternative, turning back, returning to Spain with empty hands, with stories, but no proof. The failure would not be violent. It would be quiet and permanent. This was not a choice between success and failure. It was a choice between continuing uncertainty and confirmed defeat. The sea did not change. Hours passed. At some point, the night reached its deepest darkness, the moment when even expectation feels tired. Then, just before dawn, something shifted. A sound, different, a cry from the bow, not loud, not triumphant, careful. Then another voice, confirming. A shape on the horizon, low, dark, uncertain. No one celebrated yet. They had learned not to trust shadows, but the ship changed course slightly, slowly, deliberately. As light began to gather at the edge of the sky, the shape did not disappear. It became clearer. Land. The night did not end with a decision. It ended by postponing one. Had the sea remained empty until morning, the voyage would have turned back. History would have closed quietly. Instead, the night held long enough, not because of certainty, not because of proof, but because no one forced the choice too early. Later, this moment would be described as courage, as vision, as the triumph of belief. But on the Santa Maria, that night felt like endurance, like waiting without knowing whether waiting was wise. The men did not speak much as dawn arrived. They watched the coastline approach, aware that something had been narrowly avoided. The sea receded behind them, unchanged, as if it had never held them in doubt at all. This night remains not because of discovery alone, but because it shows how close the world came to staying exactly as it was. One more hour of darkness, one less breath of patience. That was all it would have taken. Some nights change history not through bold action, but through restraint, through the decision to wait just a little longer when turning back feels safer. The Santa Maria sailed on, and the night, having tested belief to its limit, finally let go. Episode 4, The Rainy Night Before Waterloo, 1815. The rain did not stop. It fell steadily without urgency, as if the sky itself had decided to delay everything. The fields outside Waterloo were already heavy. By nightfall, they had become something else entirely. Mud. Boots sank into it. Wheels resisted it. Horses struggled to find footing. This was not how a battle was meant to begin. Inside a small tent, light flickered against canvas walls. Napoleon Bonaparte sat alone, studying a map that no longer matched the ground outside. The plan was clear. It always had been: a decisive engagement, a rapid strike. Movement before hesitation could take hold, but plans depend on conditions. And tonight, the conditions were changing. The rain pressed against the tent in a constant rhythm, not violent, persistent. It soaked the earth slowly, turning precision into resistance. Napoleon had won battles before, many of them. He understood risk. He understood uncertainty. What unsettled him now was not the enemy, but the loss of control over timing. Artillery could not move easily in mud. Cavalry charges lost momentum. Orders, once clear, would arrive late. The battlefield was becoming unresponsive. Outside, soldiers waited. Not in fear, but in expectation. They trusted routines. They trusted schedules. They had learned that when morning came, action followed. Tonight, morning felt uncertain. Napoleon traced familiar lines on the map with his finger, positions that had been measured carefully, distances calculated under ideal assumptions. The map remained dry. The ground did not. This was not a moment of panic. It was a moment of adjustment. Delay the attack or force it through unfavorable conditions. Neither option promised clarity. Waiting had risks. So did proceeding. The rain continued. It did not respect reputation. It did not acknowledge experience. It treated every army the same. Napoleon understood this better than most. His success had always depended on speed, on momentum, on forcing events to unfold before opponents could adapt. Mud removed speed. It asked patience of a man who had built an empire on decisiveness. Reports arrived intermittently, movements observed, positions shifting slightly. Nothing alarming, nothing reassuring. The night stretched. Napoleon lay back briefly, not to sleep, but to think. The sound of rain became background, steady enough to blur time. In these hours, there were no dramatic realizations. only the growing sense that the battle would not be fought on his terms alone. This was not defeat, not yet, but it was resistance of a kind no enemy general could command. Nature had entered the equation. Morning would come regardless of readiness. The rain might stop, or it might not. The ground would not recover quickly. Napoleon knew that hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. Allies waited for signs. Enemies watched for delay. Yet forcing action could turn advantage into exposure. This night was not about choosing victory or loss. It was about choosing which uncertainty to accept. The rain softened nothing. It only revealed limits. As dawn approached, the sound of water finally eased. Not completely, just enough to suggest possibility. Napoleon rose. Orders would be given soon. The decision to wait, made quietly in the night, would shape the morning. Later, historians would debate whether the delay mattered, whether the rain changed history. Standing in the tent, listening to water drip from canvas edges, it felt simpler than that. It felt like a reminder that not all variables belong to strategy. Some nights exist to show where control ends. When morning finally arrived, the battlefield was still heavy. Movement was slow. The rain had done its work. The battle that followed would be remembered for its outcome. But this night mattered because it marked the moment when certainty slipped without a fight. Napoleon stepped outside. The sky was lighter now. The ground was not. The night had passed, leaving behind conditions that no map could correct. Some decisions are made boldly. Others are made by waiting and accepting what remains. This night belonged to the second kind. A night where nothing dramatic happened, yet everything became harder. The rain did not choose sides. It simply fell. And by morning, the world was less willing to move as planned. Episode 5, Lincoln's Night of Decision, 1862. The building was quiet. Not empty, but settled, as important places often are at night. Most of the lights were out. Corridors stretched longer in the dark. Footsteps echoed differently, as if the walls themselves were listening. One room, however, remained awake. A single lamp burned low on a desk. Papers lay spread before it, some neatly arranged, others left open, unfinished. At the center of the room sat a man who had not slept well for months. Abraham Lincoln read the same lines again, not because they were unclear, but because their weight had not changed. The document in front of him was not long. It did not promise immediate peace. It did not guarantee victory. It declared an intention that could not be undone once spoken. Outside these walls, a nation was already at war. Men were dying every day. Families were counting losses in numbers that felt unreal. The pressure to act was constant, from generals, from politicians, from people who believed that action itself would restore control. But this decision was different. It was not about tactics. It was not about territory. It was about meaning. Lincoln understood the risk clearly. If he signed the document too soon, it could fracture what little unity remained. Border states might leave. Allies might hesitate. The war could become something darker. If he waited too long, the moment might pass. The war would continue without a moral direction. This was not hesitation born of fear. It was hesitation born of responsibility. The draft lay before him. The Emancipation Proclamation. Words carefully chosen, measured, restrained. Lincoln did not see himself as a man shaping history. He saw himself as someone trying not to break it further. The night deepened. Outside, the city was still. Inside, time moved slowly. He stood and walked the room, stopped by the window, returned to the desk. The war had already taken so much. This decision would take more. There would be no applause in the moment, no immediate relief, only consequences. Lincoln believed that words mattered. Not because they were powerful, but because once released, they could not be recalled. He knew that speaking this truth would make him a target, politically, personally. It could shorten the war or prolong it. It could redefine the nation or fracture it beyond repair. This was not a question of right and wrong in the abstract. It was a question of timing. When does a truth help, and when does it harm? Lincoln bowed his head. He did not ask for certainty. He asked for clarity. The room offered none. This night was not dramatic. There were no raised voices, no witnesses, just a man, a document, and the understanding that silence itself was also a choice. He did not sign the paper that night. Not yet. Instead, he waited. Days later, after a costly battle, after circumstances shifted just enough, the words would be released. History would remember the declaration, the speech, the impact, but it would not remember this night. The night when the decision was already formed, but not yet spoken. The night when restraint mattered more than resolve. Lincoln returned to his chair. The lamp burned lower. Outside, the war continued without knowing what had almost been said. Some decisions do not announce themselves when they are made. They wait. They sit quietly, gathering weight, until the moment arrives when speaking does less harm than silence. This night was one of those moments that history barely records. But without it, the words that followed might never have mattered. The room grew darker. The city slept. And somewhere between the lines of an unsigned document, the future paused, waiting. Episode 6, The Night at Dunkirk, 1940. The beach was quiet, not calm but muted, as if sound itself had learned to stay low. The sea stretched out into darkness, its surface barely moving. No waves large enough to comfort. No wind strong enough to distract. Along the shore, men stood in long, uneven lines. Some sat, some lay down where they were. Others stared across the water, not expecting to see anything. Dunkirk was not meant to hold this many people. Sand had replaced roads. Waiting had replaced movement. Nearly 400,000 soldiers were pressed against the edge of the continent. They had retreated as far as retreat was possible. Behind them was an advancing enemy. Ahead of them was the sea. The day had been filled with noise, aircraft, explosions, orders shouted and lost. But night changed the rhythm. Darkness offered cover, but also uncertainty. No one knew what morning would bring. The men did not talk much. There was nothing new to say. Everyone understood the situation without explanation. If help came, it would come across the water. If it did not, there would be no further movement. This was not fear in its sharpest form. That had already passed. What remained was something quieter, suspension. Men thought of home, but without detail. They thought of survival, but without planning. The mind, when pushed too far, sometimes stops reaching forward. Boats had been promised. Not formally, not officially. The idea had moved through ranks like a rumor that refused to die. Civilian vessels, fishing boats, anything that could float. But rumors do not cross seas. The water remained empty. The night grew colder. Some men wrapped themselves in coats. Others shared what little warmth they had. Rank meant little here. Time flattened distinctions. An officer was just another man waiting for something he could not command. Across the channel, decisions were being made. Orders written, plans adjusted. But on the beach, those choices were invisible. All that mattered was whether shapes would appear on the horizon by morning. The sound of the sea became constant. A steady reminder that escape, if it came, would not be loud. It would be small, incremental, one boat at a time. This was not a battle. There would be no charge, no counterattack. It was an exercise in endurance. The men waited not because they believed in rescue, but because there was nothing else to do. At some point during the night, someone thought they saw a light. Then another. No one celebrated. They had learned caution. But as hours passed, the lights did not vanish. They moved closer, slowly boats, small ones, not warships, not symbols of power, just hulls and engines and hands that had chosen to come. There was no announcement, no signal. Movement began carefully, quietly. Lines shifted. Men stood. The evacuation would take time, far more time than anyone wanted. But the night had changed, not decisively, not completely, just enough. Those who boarded first did not cheer. They looked back at the beach where thousands still waited. No one believed the danger had passed. But something had broken the stillness. The sea, which had been empty for so long, was no longer indifferent. By dawn, the process would become visible, documented, named, but this night would remain mostly unrecorded. A night of restraint, of not running, of not collapsing. A night where survival depended not on courage alone, but on patience shared by many. The men on the beach did not know how many would be saved. They did not know how history would describe them. They knew only that waiting had not been a mistake, that staying in place when instinct urged movement had allowed something fragile to reach them. Some nights change the world not by decisive action, but by collective stillness, by the choice to remain when escape is uncertain and hope is thin. The boats continued to arrive quietly, and the night, having tested endurance to its limit, began to loosen its hold. Episode 7. The night of the Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962. The room was underground. No windows, no natural light. Only clocks. They marked different cities, different continents, different possible endings. The air was still, carefully controlled, as if even oxygen had been measured. This was the White House Situation Room, and it was night. Above ground, the city slept. Cars moved through empty streets. Lights went out one by one, but beneath it, time refused to settle. John F. Kennedy sat at the center of the room, listening. Around him were men trained to speak clearly, to present options, to calculate consequences. Tonight, their words felt heavier than usual. On the table were photographs, grainy, taken from high above the earth, missile sites in Cuba, weapons capable of reaching American cities in minutes. The facts were not in dispute. The interpretation was, what mattered was not whether the missiles existed, but what should be done about them. Every option carried risk. An airstrike would remove the threat, but likely provoke immediate retaliation. An invasion would escalate faster than anyone could predict. Doing nothing would invite disaster of a different kind. This was not a moral debate. It was arithmetic. Lives counted in millions. Time measured in minutes. The room was quiet when no one spoke. Each pause extended longer than comfort allowed. Kennedy did not rush the silence. He understood that speed here could become a weapon against judgment. The men around the table represented institutions, the military, intelligence agencies, advisors who had spent their lives preparing for war. War, in theory, was manageable. What stood before them now was something else. Total destruction with no winner. This night stripped modern language down to its limits. Words like deterrence and strategy felt thin. No model could account for everything. No precedent offered reassurance. Kennedy leaned back in his chair, hands folded. He had asked for opinions. He had received them. Some urged immediate action. Others urged restraint. Each argument made sense until it was carried far enough. The room existed in tension between decisiveness and survival. Outside the room, the world continued without knowing how close it was to stopping. In homes across the country, radios sat silent. Televisions were off. People slept because they had not been told otherwise. This was not secrecy. It was containment. Information, like force, had to be controlled. Kennedy thought of responsibility not as authority, but as burden. The burden of being the last person to decide whether the future continued. He knew that history would later simplify this moment, reduce it to boldness or courage. But inside the room, it felt closer to restraint. The hardest decision was not what to do. It was what not to do. He considered delay. A blockade instead of a strike. Pressure without immediate violence. It would be seen as weakness by some, as indecision by others. But it preserved time. And time, tonight, was the only resource that did not destroy something when used. The night wore on. Messages were drafted, rewritten, softened. Language mattered more than ever. One word too sharp could close a door that needed to remain open. Kennedy approved communication channels that allowed responses without forcing conclusions. This was not victory. It was balance. Across the world, similar rooms existed. Similar calculations were being made. Two systems stared at each other through layers of machinery and fear. Neither could fully see the other's restraint. The danger was not malice. It was momentum. This night was spent slowing momentum. By early morning, a path had been chosen, not a solution, a delay. A narrowing of options toward survival. The missiles would not be fired. Not tonight. No alarms sounded. No alerts reached the public. The night ended without visible consequence. History would later mark this crisis as a turning point. Proof that restraint could hold even at the edge of annihilation. But this night itself left little trace. No single sentence, no defining gesture, only the absence of catastrophe. The world woke up unaware that it had come closer to ending than it ever would again. Some nights change history not by action, but by refusal. By the quiet decision to let morning arrive. This was one of those nights, and because nothing happened, everything else could. The nights we remember are usually the ones that ended loudly. A battle begun, a declaration signed, a city taken, a world changed. But most nights do not announce themselves that way. They pass quietly, without witnesses, without records, and yet they hold the same weight. Tonight, somewhere in the world, someone is sitting in a room much like the ones you have heard about. A desk, a window, a light left on longer than planned. Nothing historic, at least not yet. No armies wait outside. No maps cover the walls. Only a decision that has not been made. History often gives the impression that change is sudden, that the world turns because someone acted boldly. But as you have seen, many turning points begin with restraint, with waiting, with silence, with the decision not to act until the cost of acting becomes clearer than the cost of waiting. The nights we revisited were not powerful because of certainty. They were powerful because of doubt, because the people within them understood what was at stake and still chose to pause, to listen, to endure, to remain present when escape was available. Not every night leads to a different world. Some nights lead nowhere at all, and that is not failure. It is permission. Permission for the future to remain open. You may carry a question tonight, something unfinished, something unresolved, a choice that feels too large for daylight explanations. That is all right. History is not made only by those who decide quickly. It is also shaped by those who wait until a choice can be carried without breaking what surrounds it. Most nights are not recorded because nothing happens, but sometimes nothing happening is exactly what the world needs. The people in these stories did not know how they would be remembered. Some were praised, some were criticized, some were misunderstood, but in their nights there was no audience, only consequence. Your night does not need an audience either. You do not need to name your decision. You do not need to solve it before morning. Some choices are not meant to be rushed. They sit with us, testing patience, testing endurance, testing whether we can hold uncertainty without forcing an ending. The world you wake up to tomorrow will feel the same as it does now, and yet something unseen may have shifted, a direction not taken, a reaction delayed, a silence maintained. These things matter more often than we realize. History does not only belong to those whose names are remembered, it also belongs to the countless nights that never asked to be noticed. Nights where restraint prevailed, where escalation was resisted, where nothing happened, and because of that, everything continued. If you are still awake, listening to this, you are not behind. You are not late. You are simply in the space before a decision. That space has value. It protects you from conclusions that arrive too soon. It allows tomorrow to remain flexible. The nights still unchosen do not demand answers. They only ask that you remain. So let this one pass. Let it remain unnamed, unresolved. Let morning arrive without forcing meaning onto the dark. Some nights change the world. Others make room for the world to keep going. Tonight can be one of those.